It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from London, Daily Beast world editor Nico Hines. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. Good evening.
Good evening as well to Victor Mallet, Paris bureau chief for the Financial Times.
Good evening.
How are things?
Very good. Yep.
Very good.
Fully vaccinated.
Fully vaccinated.
Ready to go.
All right, we won't ask any personal questions to Catherine Field, European correspondent for New Zealand Media and Entertainment. It's not mandatory yet in France.
No, it's not, but I'm fully vaccinated too.
Okay. All right. From Washington, from the safe distance of Washington, D.C., France 24 correspondent Kedevan Gorgistani. A lot of people asking us, Kedevan, when are you going to let Europeans back in?
Oh, we are asking the same questions at all the press briefings here in the U.S. A lot of European journalists, especially, wanting to know when they will be able to go back and have their families come and visit them.
All right, well, we'll be talking more about that in a little while. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag World This Week. It's a pop song written for England's hosting of the European Football Championships way back in 1996. Nico, if I understand correctly, there's another game taking place on Sunday?
I believe so, yeah. We weren't expecting this to happen ever again in the history or the future of mankind, but England are actually in the final of a major tournament for the second time in the last 70 years. And I guess you'd have to constitute that as football coming home.
It's the 6 games out of 7 played at home. This England team, we'll talk more about it in a moment, but I noticed there's even a petition up before Parliament to make next Monday a bank holiday. Have you signed that petition, Nico?
I don't think I need to sign the petition. I think if there's one thing we know about Boris Johnson is that he loves jumping on populist bandwagons, and I don't think there could be anything more popular than declaring a bank holiday. There was some suggestion that they would unilaterally declare the Monday, the next Monday coming to be an immediate bank holiday if we win, but I think more realistically they might do the Monday after that. So we'll have a second round of celebrations and people will just have to work through their hangovers on Monday morning. Now, don't let it be said that I'm being presumptuous here. Obviously, everyone in England expects that we will lose the final because we are still English after all.
Still English after all. And in fairness to the Prime Minister, tempted as he may be to get carried away, he's trying to curb his enthusiasm as best he can. Let's listen.
A bank holiday for the rest of us on Monday?
I think that would be tempting fate, Libby. Let's see what happens.
Victor Mallet?
Yes, I think he's kind of almost promised it, hasn't he? If we win, if they win, depending on, I'm English, but I'm not in England, and I'm not allowed to go there without quarantine at the moment because they're not recognising the vaccines. But no, I think this will obviously be a great moment. The question really is whether they make Gareth Southgate a national hero immediately or wait a couple of days.
Well, before I ask you about Gareth Southgate, let's talk about Boris Johnson, who we just heard. How much political mileage does he get out of this, something like this?
Well, it's a good question. I think, obviously, in the short term, it's great value. In the longer term, it's not quite so clear. He'll obviously, he hasn't done it yet, I don't think, but he'll probably try to claim that this is all the result of Brexit, triumphantly separating ourselves from the rest of the world and especially from Europe. But in the longer run, it's not clear that narrative will really hold, especially since Gareth Southgate, the manager of the team, is actually obviously was a Remainer and has tried to sort of tone down the nationalistic extremes of the fans in terms of, booing national anthems. And he's very strong on sort of racial issues, racial equality. So I think it may not last that long in terms of a big boost for a nationalist prime minister.
Yeah, in a piece that Gareth Southgate penned before the tournament, the English manager called out those who engage in online vitriol or racist abuse, like those who booed when England took the knee before its friendly against Austria. He said, unfortunately for those people that engage in that kind of behavior, I have some bad news. You're on the losing side. It's clear to me we're headed for a much more tolerant and understanding society. And I know our lads will be a big part of that. Catherine Field, your thoughts on Gareth Southgate's comments there?
Well, wouldn't it be nice if it all came true? We're all going to be a much more tolerant society at the end. We're going to be more accommodating of people of other sexual preferences, the LGBT community. It's wonderful he said it. Someone has to say it. And when you look at some of the members of the English team, particularly Marcus Rashford, who's had some really incredible initiatives to try and pick up where Boris Johnson's government has clearly failed, particularly in school lunches, helping communities. It's been very impressive. He's a man who could actually reach some of the more moderate people who support football. But at the same time, there's that group that will continue to boo the national anthem or boo when the opposite team gets the ball, gets the run of play. And that just shows Boris Johnson's pub mentality, really, where his way of running the country. It's the first thing he said the other day, even before we got talking about public holiday, was that the pubs will be able to stay open later on Sunday. And I think that's exactly the way that Boris Johnson's dealing with this big final of the Euro 2020 in 2021.
Of course, pubs. Don't knock pubs. A lot to be said for them.
They'll be open 45, I think it's 45 minutes or an hour later in case there's extra time and penalties.
Good.
There is that minor technicality of having to beat Italy, a rejuvenated Italy side with a savvy mix of youth and experience, like 36-year-old captain Giorgio Chiellini. Kedevan Gorgistani, I'm turning to you, although I hesitate to turn to you because, after all, you do have a cross of St. George on your national flag.
Yes, that is true, but I have to say, even though some of my friends and colleagues at France 24 are not going to like what I'm going to say, but I'm putting my money on Italy. I think they've been pretty much the most beautiful to watch during this Euro. We're used to this Italy with this gritty defense and not scoring many goals, and this time around we've seen this youthful team just running around, scoring goals, playing beautiful football. And I think that my money's on Italy. But of course, I think we're going to have a nice final ahead of us.
Nico Hines, of course, agrees with you.
Well, look, I think Italy definitely have played the best football. But there tends to be a thing with these tournaments where the exciting team that plays free-flowing, attacking football from the start and the neutrals all get on board with them tend to get ground down by one of the boring, obdurate teams. And the one thing that Gareth Southgate has done, he might be a kind of 21st century political leader and a important kind of thought leader in terms of what he's been saying about Black Lives Matter and taking on kind of old-fashioned, nasty views in Britain. But when it comes to managing a football team, he's an incredibly old-fashioned manager, and it's been safety first, defence first, and we might just grind that Italian, exciting, flashy team down. You never know.
All right, it's not just football, by the way, that's coming home, writes the Reuters news agency. In its report on the dangers of 60,000 plus fans congregating at Wembley Stadium, it talks about how there's going to be many more spilling out of those packed pubs that Victor Mallet is so fond of. It points to an Imperial College study that found a quadrupling of COVID-19 in England in the last month, with women 30% less likely to test positive due to differences in social mixing, which could, at least in part, be driven by Euro 2020. So it really is an issue, the fact that, well, the stadiums are going to be full. Yeah,
I mean, as soon as I saw that thing about more men being infected than women, my first question was football. It's pretty, not surprising, I think.
Meanwhile, on a continent far, far away, a very different story.
I feel really sad about not being able to meet the expectations of people who are really looking forward to attending the Tokyo 2020 Games.
Catherine Field, it's such a stark contrast between what we're witnessing on this continent with the Euros and what we're about to see in 2 weeks' time with the Olympics.
Yeah, it's been very difficult for Asia because Asia, remember, right at the start of COVID was shown to be, or thought it was going to be COVID-free. We had Taiwan, Vietnam, and all these countries that had very few cases, and now they're really hitting it hard. As for the Olympics, you do have to pose the question that should it go ahead? Should it go ahead? They just say, okay, sorry, Tokyo, we'll put you in line for whichever the next Olympic Games coming up, because part of sport are the fans, are the people, are the crowds who cheer everyone on to do that much more, go that much higher, that much faster. And if you're going to do it, just have athletes there who have trained to be at these games and just put them at risk as well. Is it really worth it? I don't know. Give it a couple of years and have the Paris Olympics in 2024, and then that will be the next one, is my thought.
Kerevan Gorgistani, you agree?
Well, it is very odd to see the differences in how different continents really take on these big sporting events. You had the White House saying they totally approve what the Japanese are doing with the Tokyo Olympics, while at the same time here in the United States you have packed stadiums for all different sporting events. You have the NBA Finals going on right now with full arenas. You have baseball, and there's really some stadiums have vaccine requirements, but not all of them. So it's really odd to see the different approaches happening.
Yeah, this issue of how risky is it now to be congregating when the Delta variant is starting to run rampant on many continents. Let's talk about the situation here in France. In case you didn't know it, the health minister is also a doctor. His name is Olivier Véran. Here you see him on Thursday vaccinating citizens in the Paris suburb of Nanterre to try and convince doubters to get their jabs. He's still got his work cut out, it seems, particularly among young people.
On laisse venir et puis on verra.
Peut-être que dans 6 mois, je serai vacciné. Je sais pas, je suis entre deux eaux encore.
Maybe in 6 months I'll be vaccinated. I haven't decided yet. Catherine Field.
It's really difficult to understand why someone would say that, because it's so easy to get vaccinated in France now. February, March, April, it was really difficult. It was hard to get an appointment. You had to be a priority. But now you can get a walk-in vaccination. It does make you wonder if now that the threat level does seem so low, particularly here in France, summer is coming up, that it's gone off the boil. It's out of people's minds that the danger is there. We no longer have those days where we see hundreds of deaths every day and you really feel as though this is dangerous. That's not happening. So, the government's got to get out there and do more. I know they're doing more. They're closing some vaccination centres here in Paris and moving them to the coastal areas where people are going on holiday. But, they're going to have to do more from next week. They're going to get GPs, doctors to go through their lists and phone the people who haven't been vaccinated to try and get them in and get it done. But certainly someone's dropped the ball somewhere. If in this day and age, a 20-something-year-old can say, oh, no, I'll wait for 6 months.
And we had that promise months back by the French President Emmanuel Macron that the vaccine wouldn't be mandatory. It appears as though that's on the cusp of changing. He's going to be speaking next Monday, Victor Mallet. We know there's been meetings between the government and local officials and health officials and sanitary officials and advisors, and we're pushing towards a situation where they're going to oblige essential care workers, hospital workers, nursing home workers to get their jabs. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's those people that they're prioritizing. I don't think they're going to make it compulsory for everybody. But it is slightly odd that so many care workers who have complained quite rightly about the massive workload of dealing with so many people sick with COVID, are reluctant in many cases to get the vaccine. It's significant, I think, that most doctors are, of course, getting the vaccine. It tends to be nurses and other care workers who perhaps aren't quite as well informed as the doctors would be about the dangers or the lack of danger of the vaccine and the dangers of COVID, who seem to be, the more reluctant ones.
It's mandatory for other diseases.
Well, exactly.
For essential care workers. So should it be mandatory for COVID?
Hepatitis B, and so on. And yes, and the reason is not only to protect the care workers themselves, it's of course to protect their patients. And that is why, I think it's almost inevitable that will happen. I mean, remember going into this epidemic, France was one of the most vaccine-skeptical countries in the world. But actually, that has changed quite dramatically over time as the disease, has shown itself to be so dangerous, and the vaccines have essentially shown themselves to be extremely safe. So, I think we could see a situation where more people will get vaccinated, and the young people in particular will need to be vaccinated if they want to travel. And I think that will be a big incentive for them to do so.
Nico Hines, in the UK, mandatory vaccines for essential care workers, is that something talked?
Yeah, they're debating. Well, I think they've said that they will try and bring it in for care workers. And they're kind of hinting that they might think about doing it for other healthcare workers. And it is a very interesting kind of topic. It's the last time Britain tried to make a vaccine mandatory was in 1853 with the smallpox vaccine. They brought it in, they made everybody take it, and it was so unpopular, there was such massive uproar that they ended up, by the end of the century, 1898, they brought in a new law that said they would never make a vaccine mandatory, and this would be the first time that they've done it. Now, the government's saying it's not really mandatory because care workers could technically say, okay, I won't work in a care home anymore, I'm going to go and get another job in a shop, and therefore I'm not being made to have a vaccine. But it is a real kind of tenet of freedom that you do have that right to be a conscientious objector.
Ketevan Gorgesani, we're out of time, but just tell me briefly, what about in the U.S.?
Well, the White House is not even encouraging businesses to implement a requirement for vaccine, let alone have a federal mandate, because, of course, they know that if they do that, they're going to be crucified by the Republicans. Some Republicans comparing just the push to try to convince people to get vaccines, comparing it to Nazi Germany. So you see the political divide there. So here in the U.S., a vaccine requirement nationally is totally out of the question. Some places are doing it. Some hospitals have already fired people who did not want to get the vaccine. But then you have some other states, Republican states, that passed laws banning companies from requiring vaccines.
All right, that cultural divide there extending to vaccines. Many thanks. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Daily Beast world editor Nico Hines joins us from London. Welcome back as well to Victor Mallet, Financial Times Paris bureau chief, Catherine Field, European correspondent for New Zealand Media and Entertainment, and France 24 Washington correspondent Ketevan Gorgesani. Who ordered the assassination of Haiti's president? On Jovenel Moïse's watch, the breakdown of law and order, the rise of gang rule had reached new proportions. But to be gunned down in the night at his private residence is a shock. Neighbors heard 2 hours of gunshots, they say. Police only secured the scene at dawn. The First Lady airlifted to Miami in critical but now stable condition. And on Thursday, the police parading what they describe as mercenaries, who they blame for the attack.
We captured 17 people, among them 15 Colombians. We identified them with their Colombian passports. There are 2 Haitian Americans among those captured.
Nico Hines, we were reporting a few months back on the death on the battlefield of an African head of state, Chad's Idriss Déby. Here, we're completely in the dark once again.
Yeah, and this is a really terrifying situation. Obviously, what it does show is just how dangerous Haiti is. I mean, our Daily Beast correspondent, who has been working in Haiti for decades, has not been there for months because the violence, the kidnappings, the instability has been so bad in recent months that she hasn't felt safe enough to even be there. And that's, someone who's used to that, to working in those sorts of conditions. This story is extraordinary, and it just doesn't quite seem to add up at the moment. I think there's still a lot more to come in terms of who ordered this, what were these mercenaries doing. Some of the reports suggest that they encountered they somehow tricked their way in, they didn't have to shoot their way in, that they immediately got to him and killed him. But if that was the case, why didn't they get the hell out of the country before everybody noticed and daylight came up? Other reports are saying there were hours of gunfire in the night. In which case, where are all the bodies? Which soldiers were killed that were defending the president, or were there any victims on the other side? I don't think we're getting the full story as yet, and it may be weeks or even months before we do find out.
And the confusion, it's all around, because there's confusion over what happened, Catherine Field. There's confusion over who's running the country, because there are dueling constitutions. And according to one of them, it's the head of the Supreme Court, who, by the way, recently died of COVID. Mm-hmm. And the other, it's the prime minister. Except there's even there two different prime ministers. One had been named the day before, but hadn't yet been sworn in.
Yeah, I think on this one, we can really start to look at what has been going on in Haiti not just since that massive earthquake they had in 2010, but before that. This is a country that has received enormous amounts of aid. It's received an enormous amount of help in trying to prop up the institutions of a state, which clearly have not worked. So what happened to those $13 billion of aid that has been pumped into Haiti, that is meant to provide stability, a civil society, to make some sort of functioning country, which it clearly isn't. And there's been another sort of interesting aspect of the COVID on this one, is that Haiti, yes, is a very poor country. It's one of the poorest in that region. And it depends on remittances. And it hasn't had the remittances coming from expats. So the whole situation in Haiti has been getting more and more desperate. And the other thing is those remittances, when they come, generally are not used, according to the data, to go into the local economy. They're used to get out of Haiti. They're used to find some way of getting a passport, getting onto a plane to get out of Haiti and try and find life somewhere else. So, yeah, you could almost put Haiti in the same basket as Somalia, Afghanistan, these countries that, for all intents and purposes, are almost failed states, dependent on aid just to keep going.
Remittances, money sent by the diaspora from places like the Brooklyn neighborhood of Flatbush, home to a sizable Haitian community.
It's a real blow for us because the president was killed while he was still in power. But I don't feel bad because these people weren't running the country well. Moise was a thug. They killed a thug.
It's a bad thing for real. Even I don't like him, even he don't like him, even you don't like him. He's not supposed to die like that.
We want Haitians in the country and Haitian out of the country to come together. We can't trust the foreigners. We can't trust neither the State Department or those people. Many of those rogue diplomats, French, Canadian, and all those white former colonials sitting down making decisions on Haiti.
And Kedevan Gorgestani, there is a lot of resentment towards the international community, including against the United States, for not having spoken up more when Jovenel Moïse tried to change the Constitution, and that there were essentially, the U.S. accused of giving him a free pass. And it's interesting because we've heard mixed things from Haitians in the last 24 hours. They want help from the United States. They want an independent international inquiry. But they also want to restore some of the hurt pride we heard in those remarks.
Yes, and it shows really this really different approach from the Haitians vis-a-vis the Americans. You can see it in how the U.S. is responding to the situation right now. I was at the White House press briefing yesterday, and Jen Psaki was asked multiple times and in very different sort of questions about the situation in Haiti, and the response was pretty much the same over and over and over again. She said, we support the democratic institutions of Haiti. We stand by the fact of holding elections by the end of the year, and we are there to assist Haiti if they ask for it. They have actually asked for it now, and just moments ago in today's briefing, Jen Psaki, the press secretary, announced that there was a U.S. delegation going to Haiti to help with security issues with the investigation, including FBI officials who are going now to Haiti to help out with figuring out what's going on. But overall, it seems that the U.S. doesn't really know where to position itself regarding the political situation in Haiti. And we've heard some Haitians, especially Haitians here in the United States, saying that, well, the Biden administration is not really taking a position. They're just pretty much following what previous administrations had done, including Donald Trump, and basically letting things flow and not really taking a position or intervening, and not really, trying to do something to help Haiti.
Victor Mallet, that's interesting what Kedevan is bringing up, because we've heard Haitians say, well, the Americans ready, and the French, ready to give whoever's in power in Haiti a free pass as long as they don't side with Cuba and Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, it's one more example of a country where the West is not really able to exercise, the influence or the power that it wants to do. To me, it's just very worrying, because it's one more example of an unstable country, one more assassinated president, one more excuse for war. It's slightly ominous that, you had this sort of report that some of the people may have come over from the Dominican Republic. So it's just a sort of, it seems to, one doesn't want to be too pessimistic about the world, but really a lot of the places where the US and its allies try to sort of exercise influence, they're not really able to do so in any effective way.
Yeah, we go around the table, Nico Hines, but of course we're no closer to figuring out who done it, who are these people who've been arrested, these Colombians and Haitians who are naturalized Americans.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of dichotomy there, because if they were such brilliant commando unit, as some people are saying, why did they not manage to get themselves across the border into the Dominican Republic where they could escape? So it seems to me that if they didn't get out of the country quickly, they must have believed that either that they were going to start some sort of a coup, and perhaps the people had told them that they would then be safe. And they would be part of the, protected by the new administration that was going to come in. But that doesn't even seem clear, because normally in these situations you ask yourself, well, who stands to gain from this? And in this case, we've got two prime ministers, both of whom claiming that they should now be the one to take control. Claude Joseph kind of leapt immediately to kind of prime suspect number one in my mind when he first of all announced the death early on in the early hours while the rest of Haiti was still asleep. He was already doing interviews on the radio. He was doing interviews with international media within 12 hours and claiming that he was now running the entire country and had assumed the presidency. And that always makes people think, this is a guy who maybe had a motive for commanding it. Now, this is pure speculation. I don't have any evidence to back that up. But what you have to try and do in these situations is imagine why would something like this happen.
Or you, Kedevan Gorgistani, you could also wonder, the former president, the predecessor, you're allowed to run twice for president in Haiti, but you can't run consecutively. Michel Martelly, Moïse was his protege. They had a falling out. He certainly stands to benefit if ever there is an election.
Yes, I mean, it is totally a possibility, but of course, it is, as we've all said, still very early and things are still very murky and no one really knows exactly what has happened. And you see that with also going back to the reaction from the US, they're extremely careful in the wording that they use and extremely careful to try to not take sides, to try to not name names, talking about being for the democratic institutions and insisting that they have very little information right now. And so they're trying to stay as far away as possible until they know exactly what happened. And as one of the guests was saying, there are things that just don't seem right, things that just don't fit. And I feel that the Americans sending that delegation to Haiti is to try to figure out what exactly happened and to have a better idea of who might be behind it. Because if they take a position for the acting prime minister and then it turns out that he had something to do with it, then the Americans are in a very bad situation. So I think they're trying to wait and see what really has happened, and then they'll make a decision or an announcement.
There's plenty of other suspects, by the way, that are possible in all of this. So, yeah, it's something we're definitely going to continue to follow. And if the United States doesn't want to own this crisis, well, it's because it's got enough on its hands trying to pull out from Afghanistan. This as the Taliban continue to gain ground.
We did not go to Afghanistan to nation build. And it's the right and the responsibility of the Afghan people alone to decide their future and how they want to run their country.
And Victor Mallet, that brings us back to what you were saying just moments ago about the West's position in the face of these crises. In the case of Afghanistan, it's been 20 years.
I was in Kabul a few days after the Taliban were driven out by the Americans and their allies. And of course, you've seen what you've seen in other places, which is quite a swift military victory over somebody the Americans wanted to get rid of, in this case the Taliban, because they were protecting al-Qaeda after 9/11, and then followed by an increasingly difficult insurgency, which the American military is just not able to manage. And they've now, 20 years later, they've given up and decided to go. It's similar in a way to what's happening in the Sahel with the French announcing today, President Macron announced that he was cutting the number of troops by half to 2,500 for Operation Barkhane, because after that great military success in 2013, when they rescued Mali from jihadists, they're now faced with apparently endless, what Macron called an infinite war against all kinds of different jihadi groups that they can't manage.
And this, the way this pullout happened last week at Bagram Air Base, they reportedly left the lights on inside the base so that the locals wouldn't know that they'd finished leaving.
Yeah, I mean, this is not good for sort of America's reputation as the defender of democracy and civilian governments around the world. And, it obviously has resonance with Vietnam, 1975 and so on. And it's just, and we've seen, similar insurgency problems in Iraq. And it apparently is difficult for the United States or its allies to go beyond that swift military victory and actually, as Biden said, nation build. That is the responsibility of the countries. But of course, the Americans did try to help Afghanistan nation build and did try to do some of it themselves, and they did not succeed.
All right. So as the Taliban this week claimed to have taken over points at several northern borders with Iran, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, the Tajiks giving a heads up to a Russian-led regional security cooperation group, Moscow answering in kind.
President Putin has been in contact in recent days with the leaders of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, including, most importantly, on this topic. We will honor our commitments. Somebody here asked, I read somewhere or heard on TV, will we introduce troops into Afghanistan? I think the answer is obvious.
All right, no new sequel to the Soviet invasion. Who then to step in? Well, the Daily Beast last week pointing out that the difference with 1979 or 2001 when the Americans came is that back then neighboring China was not a player. Times have sure changed, Nico Hines.
Yeah, and, China might have the smartest move here, which is don't try and, take control of the country. Don't try and subdue the various rebel groups. Just offer to help, spend money, and as a result, become a kind of ally. The interesting thing about Afghanistan, I think people think of it as a sort of backwater or a faraway land, but it's actually in a crucial strategic area. China can basically have a land route right from China right into Europe if they just go through Afghanistan and Iran. Russia, obviously, likewise wants to have routes down into the Middle East. And, you can see why countries want to be able to, use the land in Afghanistan. And perhaps China's offer of a kind of friendly handout and then perhaps, now you owe us a few favours down the way, might be a more successful route than the Soviets and the Americans have found.
We're looking at, Catherine Field, at that map that it's part of that China's Belt and Road Initiative, which would go from China down to the Arabian Sea through Pakistan. But Afghanistan would be a big part of it.
I think it was your colleague, Leila Jacinto, of the France 24 internet site, who said, yeah, but you've got to have stability to have that sort of infrastructure project put in. The type of infrastructure project that the Chinese do, you do need to have stability. And there is no stability in Afghanistan. Plus, in the next couple of months, you're going to start seeing not just the Chinese getting involved there. You're going to start seeing Pakistan. You're going to see India. You're going to see Russia. You're even going to see the Turks getting involved. And they're all going to want a piece of the action. So you're going to have more...
Do they really want a piece of the action? I mean, we've just been describing how much of a mess it is.
Yeah, and that's why it's a mess. You've got such a fractured population in Afghanistan, so many different interests, so many different tribal factions having allegiances here, allegiances there. You're not going to have the sort of stability in Afghanistan that China likes. China does not like going into places where it's unstable.
There's also this weird contradiction. If China was to support the Taliban, which people have said it might do or wants to do, it would be completely contradictory with its other policies. So it would be supporting essentially a murderous terrorist group, as it's seen by most of the world, while persecuting peaceful Muslims at home. It simply doesn't
buying
really
the
make any
peace
sense.
on its own border, because there is Xinjiang province, where, as you're saying...
exactly, yeah. And I think what we're seeing is China, as it becomes more powerful, is confronting the kind of dilemmas that the United States has had to deal with since the Second World War, which is the dilemmas of a superpower. America got involved in Latin America and Central America because, it was close to the border. China, you can see, trying to get involved in neighboring countries for the same reason, as a sort of defensive mechanism, if you like, in an aggressive way. I mean, this is not going to be comfortable for China, I don't think.
But just before we go, Kedevan Gorgistani, those who regret that U.S. decision, can we safely say that they're limited to policy wonks inside the Washington Beltway?
I mean, it is actually a subject that has bipartisan support or disagreement, which way you look at it. But if you look at the population, the recent polls show that about 2/3 of Americans are actually in favor of this full withdrawal, of this end to these endless wars. And it crosses Republicans and Democrats, because remember, this was something that Donald Trump campaigned on, ending the endless war. He's the one who wanted to get out of Afghanistan by this spring, and then Joe Biden came in and followed, and they agreed on that policy on getting those troops out. Within Congress, it's a little bit more complicated. You have the hawks on the Republican side who, of course, think it's a very, very bad idea. But then you have people on the Democratic side who also think that we might need to stay a little bit longer, maybe not indefinitely, but we can't just leave like this. And that was the message that it was for them that Joe Biden was speaking yesterday when he said 6 months, 1 year, one more year. That's not going to bring a solution. It is a recipe to stay there indefinitely. And he said he did not want to send another generation of Americans to this Afghan war with no expectation of having any type of different outcome. So it gives you this idea that It is not extremely popular among politicians, but Americans feel today that the presence of American troops in Afghanistan and the risks to their lives is no longer worth it, and they feel that these troops are better off being back at home or redeployed somewhere else where they feel there is a bigger threat.
Unfortunately, we're time limited. So, Kette van Gorgestani, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Washington. Nico Hines in London, Victor Mallet, Catherine Field, thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.